Hi, I thought that for this video it would be best to try to widen the aperture a bit and to talk about great power competition. And I also wanted to have that conversation with one of the brighter young stars in the DC think tank world, Zineb Riboua. I think she's particularly worth hearing, and I really just kind of want an excuse to talk to her. So why do I want to talk to Zineb? Well, she caught my eye because besides being smart and an excellent writer, she's a Moroccan woman, and she works at the Hudson Institute. And for those of you who don't know, the Hudson Institute has a reputation for being sort of a bastion of American conservative thinking. Conservative, not MAGA, but more the sort of people who shop at J Press. They take William F. Buckley seriously, and they own lots and lots of volumes of Henry Kissinger. So she's different, right? And already that makes her interesting to me. And also, to be frank, like too many of us in the DC think tank world, where we all have remarkably similar backgrounds, and thus, unsurprisingly, we tend to think the same thoughts. And so, as a result, any time there's like a different perspective or a French perspective, I think that it's really important to amplify those voices. For me, it's not a virtuous box checking exercise, but really just like a necessary check on groupthink. And so that's why I thought it would be wonderful I could have her on the show, and I'm honored that she agreed to come on. Zineb, also by way of introduction, as I said, she works at the Hudson Institute. She is a research fellow, I think that is her title. And she did her undergraduate work in Casablanca and then I think France, but then also before going on to Cambridge and Georgetown. Zineb, hi. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Yeah, and thank you for the very, very generous introduction. I appreciate discussing with you, and yeah, thank you.
Sure, really, my pleasure. So, why don't we get at it? Let's talk about great power competition. And I know this is something that you work on a lot in at the Hudson Institute. And I thought that it would be best to really talk broadly about it before we sort of narrow down. Is great power competition really a thing? Like, how important do you think it is really for us to understand sort of the workings of the world and international relations?
I think it is. I think it's more of a cyclical thing. Historically speaking, powers go after each other, they counter each other, they compete with each other, sometimes benefit from each other. And I think that today it's clear that we're in the middle of a great power competition contest between the United States, but also United States, China, but also China and the axis it is developing with Russia and Iran, as well as North Korea. I think we're definitely in the middle of that, precisely because, as you mentioned, I work on great power competition, especially in the Middle East and Africa, and it's been clear to me that Russians, especially, for example, are competing actively for resources, for strategic choke points. They're going after very geographically attractive sites. They're doing everything they can to expand their influence. And once they do that, they bring the Iranians with them. Of course, they benefit from the Chinese type of infrastructure that was laid before they even arrived. So there is that anti-Western sentiment already propagating, and they amplify that. So of course, I think we're definitely in that type of dynamic, even more so because especially after and now during Russia's war on Ukraine, you can see how Russia is going after different regions and areas of influence. One of them is North Africa, the Sahel, and they're not doing that just by coincidence or because they're desperate. No, but because there's a real thinking behind it. And the reason why is because the war in Ukraine is also a war for the Russians against NATO, and people focus a lot on NATO's eastern flank, but there's also NATO's southern flank. North Africa, Sahel, Middle East, Africa in general are part of NATO's southern neighborhood. And so when the Russians go there, they go precisely with the idea of pushing against NATO, controlling migration routes, being in those migration choke points, being able to counter any type of counter-terror measures that NATO wants to do. All of these things, I think, help the Russians pitch their mission. And so, of course, I definitely think we're in the middle of it.
What do you think are the Russian objectives?
I think, as I stated, the Russian objective is really pushing against NATO by all means
Hmm.
necessary, and they do it in a very clever way where they're using Wagner Group as well as Africa Corps and
Hmm.
other type of mercenaries, because through these mercenaries they send like a security backup for the military juntas they are helping, or for the country or a president they're trying to court, basically saying, the West is not here to protect you, but here are some of our guys who can do the job. So they do that through Wagner. Of course, Wagner, they've really started their missions in Syria at first, but of course
Hmm.
they have to expand because of the logistic hubs. They needed to get. They were also in Libya, so they needed to find a way to move around, and part of that they were looking into Sudan. I mean, now the Russians have, thanks to actually Wagner and Wagner involvement in both sides of the war, they have access to a naval port now in Sudan. So there's the way that Wagner operates, but there's also the state-sponsored type of agreements, with all the oil and gas companies that the Russians push in Africa. So I think this is basically the way they've been working, and the objective, yeah, is it's been really pushing against NATO, because in the international forums, I mean, Africa has like the largest constituting bloc of like NATO, sorry, UN votes,
Hmm.
54 countries. If you get them on your side, it's very different from not having them on your side. And the Russians understand how much they can play around that. So this is the first one. The second one, of course, the security side of it, making sure that Westerners no longer have a say when it comes to their own regional security, which is the Mediterranean, is very important for the Russians, especially to put themselves as the middleman. That, for example, if the French want to talk to Libyans, for example, the Libyans will have to talk to the Russians at some point, just because the mercenaries are there. So the Russians become very important when it comes to mediations and any type of discussion regarding European security. And that's very key because it's a key pressuring point. So I think these are, what I would say the main objectives. It's really a political game for military aims at some point.
You've mainly been talking about U.S. or Russia versus the West, Russia versus NATO, and I suppose we should also include Russia versus the European Union. How does China fit into this? Are they aligned? Is it just a three-way thing with three different kind of actors?
Sorry, I didn't mention also Iran, because
Hmm.
Iran has I mean, what happened in Niger was especially telling, right? Because
Hmm.
the Russians, they see a problem, which is anti-French sentiment. They go there with Wagner and other mercenaries. They don't just go there with their military, but they go there with Telegram and with other social media tools. They push as much fake news against the French as possible. The Americans do not know really what to do about it, so they get confused. The Americans become confused with the French, and at some point, the military junta, because it wins the coup d'état, tells both the French and the Americans to leave. And what the Russians do next is bring other players. The main one there was Iran. Iran got a big uranium deal out of it.
Hmm.
And Niger is very rich in uranium. And so I think that's like the cyclical. It's like a pattern that you see. And of course, for China is a big investor, also partner to Africans. It's very noticeable because China has this I think every time I have a huge summit on Africa. I think every year or so. And for them to have both the Russians and Iranians as partners, it benefits them. Why? Because Europe and also the United States, they've been thinking about pushing back against China in Africa, and having partners makes it more complicated for that to ever materialize. The other thing is China doesn't really deliver on the security side,
Hmm.
but having the Russians there, it helps pitch the anti-Western type of narrative and the stance. Because at the end of the day, China also sees itself as the leader of the global South, and Russia talks about more about the multipolar world. So it means that there is, of course, they're not allies in the Western sense, but they're very much aligned on what to do next, which is make sure that the West does not have access to important regions for its security.
Must this be a zero-sum game where, like, if one country gains and the other countries lose, right? Is it, or can we not view these things more expansively and sort of like, hey, everybody's welcome into this playground and we can all do things, and there's no need to be suspicious of any of the other actors.
I mean, for Russia, China, and Iran, you mean, or for?
I mean, in general, I was sort of the play devil's advocate, but I could also sort of imagine people listening. I also sort of imagine, like, my new straw man
Yeah.
is the sort of like MAGA isolationist who would say, so what? Like, why should we be concerned about Wagner in Mali or the Central African Republic, or if the Iranians sign? Well, let's leave Iran aside, but the Chinese have all these huge mining deals. The Chinese are doing. I mean, they're everywhere economically. They're definitely the dominant player economically on the African continent. But why is this necessarily a bad thing?
Well, I think this is well, it's bad in the sense that, for example, one of the things that the United States looks at is rivalry with China, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about the pivot to Asia, that everything is happening in the Indo-Pacific. And you should double down on Indo-Pacific engagement, etc. It's I think it's fine. The problem, however, is that if China invades Taiwan tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
you need to put together a package. And part of the package is to enforce sanctions, make sure that your allies are with you, that because China relies, for example, for a huge chunk of its energy on the Middle East, but also more now they're considering Africa, and they use African ports. You want to be able to call these countries and say, "Hey, China invaded Taiwan. We're going to war against them, etc. We're doing something. We need you on our side." These countries are going to say, "No, we're not going to join any sort of U.S.-China rivalry or war or conflict." And this is where I think it matters, because while it's all happening in the Pacific, China sees the whole world as basically a chessboard where it can score points against the United States, because making sure that the day of the war that the United States cannot enforce as much pressure as possible is pretty much key to its thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and is why the Russians are important to counter, because they reinforce the mechanism that will allow any type of retaliation to fail. So I think this is how I basically think about it. Of course, I'm not saying that United States. This is, I think, where I differ with people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that the United States should be involved with troops, etc. I mean, the United States got kicked out, but there are other ways. There are other ways to remain engaged at a very deep and meaningful level, and that means understanding the dynamics and understanding the strategic environment. Because as much as it's chaotic, there are also a lot of opportunities. For example, Turkey is there. Turkey is very much involved in Africa, which means a NATO member is involved in Africa. Morocco is also much more growing in West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
The UAE, Saudi Arabia, they are seen as much more reliable partners when it comes to mining deals now, especially, for example, in Central Africa and other places, than the Chinese. So there are things that, in terms of regional coalition building, where U.S. allies are there, so that the United States does not have to be there. That there are things that can be done. The other thing is the United States. For example, with the Abraham Accords, they're speaking about expanding them, And it hasn't happened. For example, Sudan was going to be one of the biggest partners of Israel in Africa. Guess who Sudan normalized with? With Iran. And now Iran is talking about normalizing with Egypt and elsewhere. And so I think not taking into consideration the this great power competition that is happening, facilitated by Russia and China, etc., it actually jeopardizes a lot of what the United States is trying to do.
So let's talk about Sudan. I think that's super interesting. So the Sudanese regime before the civil war was apparently, so Burhan reputedly has this great relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was very much sort of trying to like tilt into the Western orbit and done a lot to like, there was this whole effort to get Sudan delisted from the list of terrorist supporting countries, and was on track. And then the civil war starts, and of course, one of probably the major sponsor of the rebel group, the RSF, is the United Arab Emirates. And Russia seemed to be playing both sides, because Russia also had ties with the RSF, but has ties with both. And it looks like what's happened, at least from my understanding, is that because the Sudanese government, or rather the regime, has been doing badly, they have ended up moving in the other direction. So into the arms of Iran, and trying to sort of get the Russians more on side by always dangling in front of the Russians the Port Sudan for a naval base. Meanwhile, the RSF is very tight with United Arab Emirates. People speculate about Israeli involvement, but I've seen no evidence of it. And from what I understand, the Israelis are just staying away. I hope they are, because that's what I would tell them to do, just stay out of it. So I guess, like, how do you view events? Like, have I got it right, like, in terms of the way things have gone? I mean, is this necessarily sort of like where we have, like, is the civil war? Does it make sense to view the civil war in Sudan through the lens of great power competition, where, like, one side's pro-Russian, the other's not, one side's pro-Iran, the other's not?
Yeah, I think very different view, and I must say
Okay.
that a very controversial one as well. I think I'm one of the few who actually think my colleagues disagree with me. Actually, it's a little debate at Hudson as well. I wrote this piece for Foreign Policy, I think a year ago, where I'm actually arguing that the Russians are on both sides. They don't care because they don't know who will win, but they want to make sure that the guy who wins next, will visit Putin in Moscow. The Iranians, they have cover involvement on both sides as well, and it's very actually hard now to determine which side is better than the other. To me, they're all bad guys, and the problem is that the United States has always this tendency to try to take a position on who is the good guy. There are no good guys here. All of them have committed enormous crimes. Hameti is involved in a genocide. Burhan is it's very actually difficult even now to understand what is going on in Sudan on the ground. So anyway, my approach is there is no other solution than to actually get both sides and make sure they agree, and have some sort of agreement where Darfur remains like some sort of independent state, etc., and that they're no longer a militia and they integrate the army, because it's a political problem that became a military one, and they're now fighting over it.
So you don't share the Emirati view that Burhan and the SAF, the Sudanese armed forces, are, like, instruments of the Muslim Brotherhood, and are just these crazy jihadis.
I mean, the problem is for the United States that Burhan is on the side of Egypt, and Egypt thinks of Burhan as a very important player. So for the United States, the moment it will take a side, it will alienate an ally. And it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, I totally understand the UAE argument. It's, I mean, there are a lot of evidence of that, etc. But I think from more of a realistic point of view, the United States should maybe play the Russian playbook, which is that these guys are not going anywhere. They even because you know what they do, especially with Hameti. I mean, he brainwashes his own people now. The people who work with them. So you have generations of you have the youth that is indoctrinated, and to the point where they will always go against each other. So finding some sort of negotiation or for the United States to mediate, I think Anthony Blinken tried to do that. I think there's still some of it is still possible. I think it's the only way to solve it.
Hmm.
I think it's very counterintuitive, but I don't see any solution to that. I mean, people are saying, arm Burhan, make sure that Hamiti is as weak, and then get a negotiation. But the problem is there is enough arms smuggling that Hamiti can sustain himself, especially in that place. And it's only, I think, a matter of time before the Russians pick their guy. I've heard that Turks are also involved in this.
Hmm.
But I think for the United States, making there is some sort of mediation is the only way. I really see it as a political problem.
I mean, first of all, I share your view that, as far as I'm concerned, both sides are bad. You know, it's like a pox on both your houses, and it's just a shame that you've got these two kind of two bad actors are struggling for power while the people suffer as a
Yeah,
result. But then I think that the best way for the people of Sudan would be just if one of the sides, and I almost don't care which, like flip a coin, which is win fast, and just to get it over with, and so that that side can consolidate power and move forward. But I wouldn't want to ever be the guy who decided, like, all right, well, which side do you pick? Like, you don't actually flip a coin. That would be crazy, because they're both really pretty bad. But negotiations, I mean, because both of them are benefiting from foreign assistance in various forms, it's almost, to me, it looks like there's no end in sight.
I I think yeah, if you still get, but here's the thing, there's no end in sight, not because there was never enough pressure
Hmm.
on the vote to sit on the table. And of course, like ending the foreign assistance would help, but I think just a little bit of more U.S. involvement and threatening with sanctions would actually do it. No one has tried that, and I think this it's a feasible. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but
I mean, there have been U.S. sanctions, I believe, against some individuals.
but
Both
it was
are.
symbolic. It was not about we're going to shut down everything until we figure it out.
Hmm.
Um, type of threat. Um, the problem is that, as you know, Darfur, there's also the ethnic
Hmm.
dimension. If it continues, I'm pretty sure that the country is going to split again, because of how far they went against each other.
Right.
Uh, and that would be actually bad, because if there is one player that will benefit from that is Russia. They're very embedded in Darfur.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think keeping that in mind.
So let's back away then from Sudan and get back to sort of great power competition. But one of the things I wanted to pursue was, you mentioned the Turks and sort of the possibility. You mentioned the Turks are NATO. They're very present. I mean, I would argue that Turkish influence, at least in the Sahel, and I think throughout West Africa, is greater than Russia's. Certainly, its economic influence is. But how exactly do they fit in? And as far as I understand it, the Turkish agenda in Africa does not really align with any kind of Western agenda. It's not something that it would be something that the Americans or the West could ride on top of and benefit from and coordinate with. It's like a whole separate thing that's just different, and it's much more aligned with the Russian approach, perhaps, or the Chinese approach.
Yes, of course. I don't think they have a Western, have a Turkish agenda.
Hmm.
Turkish agenda to expand their their reach and influence elsewhere, precisely because they are competing with Russia in Libya and the Russians are in Ukraine as well. So it's a big problem for Turkey to Black Sea security. So they have to go where they can also put pressure on the Russians, and this is why they are in Ethiopia, Somalia, etc. Of course, they have their own agenda. That being said, they are a good counter to Russia dominating everything. And it's a soft spot that I think is useful for Europeans and also for the United States. I understand there are other issues between Europe and Turkey, but there's something that Turkey does, and it's the confliction strategy.
Hmm.
They agree with you on this, but guess what? There's one thing we can agree on, and it's to not have jihadists and terrorists in the Sahel, and to have Libya a functioning state. I think on these things, there are discussions that the West can have with Turkey that cannot have with Russia. And what is actually much more good about this is that Turkey is also a counter for Iran, because what Iran does is that they go and spread to these Shia schools, seminaries. They try to expand the Shia influence. Turkey is more of it's more of a secular actually country, but it has more of a moderate tone now when it comes to practice of Islam. I'm not talking about Erdogan. I'm talking more about like the uh, state approach to Islam is much
Hmm.
more. Of course, there's not just Turkey, but there's also its partner Azerbaijan that has been signing deals with Morocco, for example, and they're thinking as well about expanding Africa. It's very important because Azerbaijan has a great relationship with Israel. Morocco has a great relationship with Israel as well. And so this is why I talked about Turkey, because I think I think there are opportunities where U.S. partners can deliver where the United States cannot, because I don't think that the United States can do things as it used to, with all these aids development programs, etc. I think a lot of it got shut down
Hmm.
precisely because it was not effective. But there are other partners who can play that role.
So this might be an indiscreet question, but why would a Moroccan care about like the United States doing well in great power competition?
I think because for a very simple reason that Morocco is the first country that recognized the United
Hmm.
States and sees the United States as a very reliable partner, and so it's a question of really making sure that the interests of the United States um, are are met. But there's just I think a sincere friendship from the Moroccan part, where it wants to see the United States do well, and they kind of have interests that are aligned, countering China, a lot of these things. Of course, China does business with Morocco, and
Hmm.
Morocco does with China.
There's a
Um,
huge, there are huge industrial projects going on now in Morocco related to electric vehicles and batteries.
yes, yeah. I so, but that still actually does not mean that, because Morocco is still a non-major NATO ally,
Hmm.
and I know that there are discussions about amplifying and pushing for more Americans, especially American companies, to come to Morocco, etc. I think it's much more. I think it's very simple. It's more of a friendship type of um, point. But also historically, Morocco has always sided with the United States against the Soviet Union, always had issues with Pan-Arabists who were spreading. Morocco was a moderate monarchy. Um, so, and also Morocco does not have that anti-Western, I think, a resentment historically,
Hmm.
and has good ties with Europeans and so on. And I think it really stems from that.
Okay. So, right, because Morocco never got into like the Nasser's pan-Arabism or
Yes,
the whole kind of anti-colonial mindset. Uh,
yeah.
I think is a different approach. So, speaking of that, though, particularly also in light, I read your wonderful Substack piece about anti-colonialism, but I was thinking about something that you mentioned about the Russians in Africa, and it's certainly very, very true and very appropriate, is sort of the role of Russia and the place of Russia in sort of the public opinion, the public sphere, certainly in Africa, and also vis-a-vis the West. And clearly what I see going on throughout sub-Saharan Africa is this sort of rise of this pro-Russian populism.
Mm.
So it's pro-Russia, anti-West, anti-France, to a lesser extent anti-U.S., but definitely anti-Western, definitely pro-Russian. The sentiment, and it's associated with this form of Pan-Africanism that's really on the rise that Uh, I don't like to call it Pan-Africanism because when you compare it to the Pan-Africanism of the 1950s or 1960s, like to me it seems like really particularly shallow, but
Yeah.
it's there, right? And this is what's going on in Burkina Faso and Mali, Niger, and it could be, but it's to be found everywhere in West Africa. So the question is, and this is what the Russians exploit. They take advantage of it. They fuel it, and they take advantage of it. How does one counter that though? Like, so I mean, the Russians don't cause it. The Russians just take advantage of it. So you can't stop them from taking advantage of it. But can you, or maybe you can, but can you stop it from happening so that they can't take advantage of it?
Like you mean like to stop the anti-Western sentiment?
Right. It's like an ideological struggle. Like how do you push back against the anti-Western, pro-Russian Pan-Africanism that we see everywhere?
Yeah, so I think there are I think the first step is for the West to recalibrate its approach and to actually understand that the Russians are competing with them. I think a lot of them do not see that way. They think that the Russians are just there to do their own thing, and that doesn't necessarily translate um, um, into the outcomes we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Changing the perspective is a huge deal. Why? Because the Russians are offering to these African countries what the West is not offering, which is pure transactional, project. And where the West goes and wants to do state building and a lot of these things, but these countries they're struggling with basic things like terrorism. And the moment you talk to them about something else, they get hostile. And I think understanding that is key. The other thing is I don't see the West pushing back against the Russians. I talk to people all the time, and I tell them, there was this huge ambush that Tuaregs had, and the Tuaregs against the Russians in last July.
Mm-hmm.
It was such a humiliating ambush. I think they killed one of the biggest guys, players in Wagner. They completely massacred them, and it just shows you how much the Russians are weak. And I didn't see I didn't see that being amplified in Western messaging or anything. It was covered by the New York Times and some others, but it wasn't amplified because it's very important to understand the information warfare
Mm-hmm.
that is ongoing.
I don't
Uh,
think there's a coherent strategy from any Western government to try to do that kind of thing. The French don't do it, we don't do it. But you're right. Like they could have seized upon that and pushed out all sorts of memes, like make it
exactly.
let's make fun of Wagner and let's make up fun of these hapless Russians that are getting whacked in northern Mali.
Yeah, and even recently, the collapse of Assad, one of
Mm-hmm.
the first things Europeans should have done as they go and visit Africa and Egypt and these places, and is to say, this is the guy the Russians said they're always going to protect. Guess where he is now? He's hiding. Do
Mm-hmm.
you expect the Russians to sacrifice themselves for you? And I think this type of messaging just that's not I don't see it. So I think there are a lot of things like that Europe and United States also, although the United States is in a very different position right now when it comes to Russia, but the moment it will switch, I think this is the type of things they can easily amplify. Easily. I mean the Russians are doing all of these things because there's no pushback.
Right. I think that's true. So, changing topics, I want to ask you about the long, always simmering conflict between Morocco and Algeria. It's something that I see all the time on social media. Like I see Moroccans and Algerians on Twitter sniping at one another, which I find absolutely fascinating. Sometimes I want to like intervene and say, "Hey guys, cool it, man. Be friends." So I was wondering if you could tell us something about that, like the rivalry. Why are they so hostile to one another? And then after that, like, what does this matter? I mean, obviously it matters to Moroccans and Algerians, but so what?
Yeah, so I think it really goes back to really the construction of the Algerian identity after the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that it's a modern state, that it's a socialist type of state, that it's a republic, and Morocco is a retrograde monarchy that collaborates with the West, that has Jewish people part of its government. And there's a whole conspiracy side of it. Morocco is also part of this Zionist entity
Yeah.
orbit. Um, so there's a lot of that, and I can see that just because like you, I see things on Twitter, and it's sometimes very funny because it has this conspiratorial dimension, almost like hallucination, and so it's really deep in how the Algerians perceive Morocco. For the Moroccans, for a very long time, I think, really until the Trump recognized the Western Sahara and the Algerians started a campaign against Morocco, they always thought that the Algerians are very different. They're their own thing. I think many of them did not realize the extent of Algerian animosity towards Moroccans, and I think the recognition also in Morocco normalizing with Israel. I think it was really the turning point of the relationship. But of course, Algeria has always supported the Polisario Front, which is basically the militia and terrorist group that attacks Morocco and declared war against Morocco from Algeria territory in the. And Algeria has always supported the basically for Morocco to be split. And, and so there's the security dimension. Moroccans are sensitive to. I mean, taking a step back and answering your question on the rivalry, I think there is a huge rivalry right now. Because the Russians are now in the Sahel, Algeria does not have as much power and influence as it used to have, especially on Mali
Why
and
is
Niger.
that? I mean, first of all, just to be clear, also for the audience, Russia and Algeria historically have been very, very close.
Yeah.
So these are like close allies. So why? Like, why is the Russian presence in the Sahel
Well,
reduce Algerian influence?
it's been complicated for Algeria. For example, Mali, they have this issue with the borders,
Mm-hmm.
even under the military junta that is supported by Russia. And because the military is supported by Russia, Algerians have a hard time uh, making sure that Malians adhere to what they perceive is a solution to the border problem or whatever. Because the Russians being there makes Algerians much more weak and cannot enforce their will upon the Mali
Mm-hmm.
government. So there's that tension, and you can see that as well with Mauritania. Um, Mauritania understands that Algeria does not have as much leverage as it used to have on Mali, for example. So it makes Mauritania much more inclined to say no now to Algeria. But also because Morocco has been expanding its influence, especially on West Africa. I mean, they've been doing that for a very long time, actually, with Sufi orders and
Mm-hmm.
moderate Islam preachings, etc., to counter the spread. But now they're going full in with infrastructure agreements, with projects like the Nigeria-Morocco pipeline. They're um, investing heavily, and so Algeria feels that being cut off. And this of course plays out not just in the Sahel and West Africa, but also at the level of the African Union. Because South Africa supports Algeria on this. Morocco has now its own coalition that it created, of Liberia and others who are very friendly to Morocco. And so this is, I think, how it plays out.
So I know that the South African thing that very much has to do with the fact that the African National Congress is very pro-Polisario, right? And it kind of comes from its own sort of revolutionary anti-colonial ideology. At least that's the way I perceive it. So South Africa is very pro-Polisario, and these things kind of go hand in hand, like pro-Polisario, anti-Israel. So they align very nicely with Algerians.
Yeah,
And then therefore then South Africa then ends up being aligned against Morocco. Then they're sort of the opposite poles.
yeah, it's as simple as you said. It's It's very convenient for South Africa.
Zineb, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much, and I'm so glad that you're able to you're willing to join me. I learned a lot, and hopefully the everybody who's watching this video will have walked away a little bit smarter about Africa and Morocco and Algeria and great power politics, great power rivalry. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.